So I'm going to talk about then the original practices for being and becoming human. We are in an era where we have all sorts of shifting baselines about what's normal. And I look at how our child rearing practices have really shifted as to what we think is normal child raising, and what we think then is normal outcomes of that child raising, what we think is normal for adults, their being, their health, their morality, and what we think is normal for a culture. Now I'm speaking from a social science perspective throughout this talk. Those are my audiences typically, so please forgive any words and terms and things that seem inappropriate, but I didn't have time to rethink all the terminology. So we know this shifting baselines notion comes from oceanographers who realized that people were marine biologists and others were assuming that the ocean that they grew up with as children was normal. That's the way it should be. And so they missed the change in the oceans. And here are two stark kind of photographs of what's happening. They did a study in 2006 where they took a boat from California to Hawaii and put a bucket over the side, replicating a study from the 50s. In the 50s, they found when they put the bucket over the side and drew it back, it was full of fish. When they replicated in 2006, it was full of plastic and no fish. So that's a sign that across generations, there's huge shifting baselines, and we have to pay attention to the bigger picture, not just what's happening now. Similarly, our forests, this is a chart that's only a short period of time, but in the 1600s, see how much old growth forest the United States 48 had, and see in 1990, that's all the further this chart went. But you know, it's even worse than the picture of the 90s. But people don't realize that this is not normal what we see, at least in the mainstream culture. So this is our heritage. And I study small band hunter-gatherers. They represent the kind of society that's 99% of our human history. They have a certain way of being, of living on the earth, nomadic foragers. And this is all over the world. They emerged, they live independently from one another, all these societies, and they have the same kind of child raising, same kind of development of good health and wisdom in the adults, and the same type of culture. I'll mention a few things, but I'm going very quickly here because my interest primarily here is the companionship, caregiving in early life, and how that has epigenetic effects on who we become, on our human nature. So every animal has a nest for its young, and I'm using scientific terms now, evolutionarily evolved to optimize development. So that nest of care matches up with the needs of that offspring. And when you have that nest, when you provide the nest to the young, they turn into a species-typical creature or plant. And it's a species-typical outcome. And for humans, we are particularly influenced by our postnatal, after-birth experience. So we are biosocially created. Our social experience is influencing and shaping our biology. So because we are dynamic systems, early experiences in a dynamic system affects the trajectory of where that system goes and how it develops. And so for all of our systems, biological, social, emotional, intellectual, all are influenced by those early experiences because of the epigenetic things happening. Epigenetics means that you have a set of genes that you inherit physiologically, but they don't necessarily get turned on or off or expressed unless you have the experience to turn them on or off or get them to be expressed. And so this early nest has an effect on how the genes are expressed. If you don't have that early nest experience, which I'll explain in a moment, those genes may never get turned on or never get turned on properly. And so forever after, you have multiple layers of things that are dysregulated in your neurobiology that affects your psychology, your spirituality, your morality, which is my area of study, morality. This is the companionship care we evolved to need. This is our nest. And I could go on and on about each of these, but I only have this one slide because we don't have much time. So touch. We know that babies need to be carried and held pretty constantly. That's what they expect. We're born 18 months early compared to other animals. We need an external womb experience. That means keeping the baby calm, and touch calms the baby. That's what they expect, to be near others constantly. Otherwise, their systems get dysregulated. And we have evidence from multiple animal studies and now parallel sort of in humans. We can't do experiments on humans, you know, but we can on animals. And we know that if you don't have a high nurturing, in the rat studies, a high nurturing mother in the first 10 days of life, the equivalent of 6 months for humans, in the first 10 days of life, genes that control anxiety never get expressed properly. For the rest of your life, that's a sensitive, critical period, those first 10 days. And if you have a, a mother that doesn't lick you very much, that's nurturing for a rat. For us, it would be caring. If you have a mother that's not nurturing, those genes never get turned on properly. For the rest of your life, when something new happens, you get freaked out. Unless you take drugs, unless they give the rats drugs, right? So that's just one aspect of touch. The researchers who do this, Michael Meany and McGill University and his colleagues, they find that hundreds of genes are turned on or off, influenced by mother's touch. They only look at 1 or 2, but they could look at a whole ton of things, right? So that's touch. Responsiveness. Babies, when they get too distressed, if you let them cry, and they shouldn't cry, they don't cry in traditional societies. If you let them cry, cortisol levels increase in the brain, extensive crying, and cortisol will melt synapses, will melt the connections of neurons that are supposed to be growing in this time. They're growing rapidly, thousands a minute, probably tens of thousands, maybe millions every minute are growing from experience. So if you let the baby cry, not only are things melting that should be growing, the wrong stuff is growing. So when you put a baby in a distressful situation, their survival systems, the old parts of the brain, get enhanced. Fight, flight, freeze, faint, and the things that are supposed to be growing after in the first several years of life, it's supposed to be pro-social capacities, the capacities to get along with others, looking people in the eye and picking up on all those interactions, the back and forth, how do you communicate in various ways. That's what's supposed to be growing. Well, that doesn't grow when they're distressed. You're now suppressing that and you're enhancing stress reactivity, which then they carry forward in their personalities for the rest of life. Breastfeeding, on average, 4 years of breastfeeding, 2 to 8, has been observed in hunter-gatherer societies. We know now, we have all the neuroscience now to back up all these aspects of the nest. And breastfeeding is got thousands, breast milk has thousands of ingredients, all the immunoglobulins to build the immune system. And the immune system is not finished, does not reach adult levels till about age 5. And that's really how long we should be breastfeeding. It's kind of a shock, I know. But there are things we could do to society to make these things possible. I could say more about that. Alloparents, these are adults who act like a mother. So this is the term from anthropology. So it's very frequently in these small band hunter-gatherers communities, 50% of the time it's other, not mothers, but other adults taking care of the child. And so these are responsive caregivers. So babies need lots of attention, babies 0 to 2.5 or so years old. Positive social support, the child should feel like they are making a positive impact on others. So when you see that they get a smile from others, they are attended to, they're talked to, you develop play and stories with others. These are basic needs that we have as human beings. Play. Babies are ready to play from birth. All social mammals, all mammals play. It's how you grow, it's how you develop your executive functions, your ability to plan, to think ahead, to be aggressive in a very pro-social way, at least assertive, we should say, probably. It's a way to control, build self-regulation in all sorts of ways. And then soothing perinatal experiences. So that's around birth time, soothing experiences, not the trauma that in the United States we typically put babies through in hospital births. So we have baby-friendly hospitals coming back, but not enough, and there's only maybe 12% in the country. I could say more about that, but I have more to say. So I'm moving on here, but you can get a sense of what the nest is like and how we're really missing it. But let's go, what happens with a good nest? We can see the brain has 3 basic systems that control, in a way, when they're activated, they shift your perception. So we have the oldest systems, our survival systems, and we share this with all animals. It's the anger, fear, panic, very basic kinds of lust, fight, flight, freeze, faint. These are things to help you stay alive. And they're very primitive, and they kick in when you feel threatened. What we normally see in good development is that in early life, some of these executive functions are growing in that first year, the prefrontal cortex, and with good development, by the age of maybe 35 till you're an adult, the executive functions have grown fully, and they will control those survival systems. This second set here on the left, at the bottom, is the social aspects, our mammalian, social mammalian characteristics. So these care and play are emotion systems that have been mapped in our brains as mammals. These grow in that first few years especially, but throughout childhood. And with good development, you spend your life in the heart-centered imagination. This is the heart-mindedness that we can see in all traditional societies around the world, that you have control over the survival systems most of the time. If you get stressed out, the executive functions kick in, and you're able to control that panic or that fear or that anger. And you have learned to do that, and your body knows how to do it from good early care. And you spend your time more in this heart-centered, imaginative. So the imagination means that you're able to think outside the present moment and think about futures, about possibilities, and in this case, it's communal. You have communal imagination. And I'll say more about what goes wrong later, but so what happens in early life, the baby learns social pleasure, being with mother, father, aunt, uncle, grandpa, grandma, sister, or brother perhaps, but in these societies, there's usually a 4-year gap between siblings, so you don't have a lot of sibling interaction. High mortality rate in small band hunter-gatherers as well before age 15, something we don't like. We also had that before 1850s in the industrial world. But anyway, what you learn is social pleasure and a sense of social effectiveness, because you've learned to be present with the caregiver. They're reverently caring for you, not punishing you, not ignoring you. You learn intersubjectivity, that shared space of back and forthness, the empathy from them. You build and you learn what it's like. You learn to perspective take as you play games with your caregiver, and you develop this empathic, what I call empathic effectivity core. You have a core of empathy, and it corrals your autonomy. In the Western world, we don't have this anymore. We've lost our core of empathy because we don't give babies what they need. What happens with these roots of what I call engagement ethics, so you're able to be present, reverent, synchronous with others, empathic, perspective taking, all these things you're building in those first 3-5 years of life. This then leads later, as your cognitive functions increase, it builds a communal imagination. You build your way of getting along with others with these kinds of orientations. And we see this. I'm trying to explain what's seen in small band hunter-gatherers, because they are so different from us, from the dominant Western kind of society. They have this built in. Tim Ingold has written about this quite a bit, and others, Colin Turnbull, anthropologists. So here's a visualization of that. So what happens is you have these empathic effectivity roots that are built in early childhood. That gives you the parameters for your sense of communion with others. And then you have, when you have the autonomy surge as you do in age 2, we call them terrible twos in the West, but traditional societies say, what's that? They don't have that kind of problem because they don't mistreat their children and punish them or put them in situations where they have to say no all the time. So they build, when that autonomy surge comes at age 2, age 13 as well, 14, I used to be a middle school teacher, When that comes, that autonomy of what I can do, what I want to show that I can, get along in the world, it's guarded by the empathy. What's happened in the West, there's no guard. I want to do what I want. I want to climb that mountain. You watch television shows, all these people acting so unvirtuously towards others. They think they can do whatever they want because it's me and I want to be. So their autonomy, they never really kind of set it up correctly. But sorry, I'm going really fast. And then what happens with your imagination, your ability to think about futures, alternatives to the present moment, you are able to reach a wisdom orientation. And then you have a community of people like this in our small band hunter-gatherers and other indigenous communities. Child outcomes, then you have committed cooperation rather than what we assume to be normal as rebellion and do-it-yourselfism that we see in our kids and encourage in the West. And in the small band hunter-gatherers, then we have adult outcomes of wise elders, which are really hard to find, I see, in the US today. But you see these basic things that we've been talking about are part of indigenous wisdom: generosity, respect, kindness, compassion, forgiveness, humility, courage, right? And I relate it in my work to these early experiences and to an ongoing childhood of respect for the dignity of that child. And so our baseline, I call this small band hunter-gatherers our baseline because it represents 99% of our history as in the human genus. They're immediate return societies. That means they don't have property. They move around, right? No cultivation, no domestication of animals, no resource accumulation. And they still exist, but they're certainly very much under pressure and to settle, and there are very few left anymore. But they demonstrate small egos in large selves, very much unlike the Western rational, self-contained, autonomous, locked within the privacy of a body, standing against everyone else, right? Competing for the rewards of success. That's what we create when we don't give children what they need. The missing nest leads to this. That's my argument. And we have instead an alternative. Our ancient instructions, our ancient practices are really vital if we're going to have a different future. We need to raise our children. I'm going to skip this. Darwin, as noted earlier, he talked about competition as a minor role, playing a minor role in evolution. Most of nature is cooperative, all the way down, all the way up. And us too. Herbert Spencer was the one at his time during Darwin's day that was pushing this selfishness orientation that, evolution is selfish. Now it's selfish genes. That's Richard Dawkins. So Darwin came up with this idea of the moral sense to show that no, morality is built into evolution. We share, and humans are the pinnacle of all these pieces that come through the tree of life, is what he was arguing. You can see social pleasure in the social mammals. All sorts of animals enjoy being with one another. They have empathy. And studies recently show elephants, rats, monkeys, of course, apes have empathy for one another. Memory function, being able to think about what you plan to do, what the reactions of the community are, and change with habit control your habits, and being concerned for the social concern for the social opinion. And we could add also higher consciousness, which I'll mention in a moment, but nomadic foragers display these things. And I argue in some papers that in the United States, all these things have diminished. And we have evidence, data, studies showing that empathy is diminishing, social pleasure. People don't want to be with other people, right? The highest number of households now is single adults. They're not getting married. They're living alone. Social concern. A lot of families are against the society, the community. Habit control. We have kids dysregulated coming to school, and so on. So what happens when companionship care is missing? Well, it starts at the beginning, and then it flows through the whole system. When all that's missing, when you're missing this kind of a childhood of caring, touch, companionship, and you have instead this kind of a childhood, which unfortunately is common. Well, that's what we study in my lab. So we call this the human evolved developmental niche, 30 to 40 million years old, these practices. It's also called the hunter-gatherer childhood model. So what do we find? All right, so actually I have this longer one. And so in this, instead of, yeah, this is what we have in the States now, right? Isolated children, sleep training, leave them alone to cry, children, not very much breastfeeding, mothers isolated with their kids, mothers expected now also to work as well as have children, children deprived of recess in most elementary schools now, no recess. And cesarean births instead of natural births still at about 33%. And so our practices of the nest, or the, I'll just call it the nest, have really decreased, especially in the 20th century. So what happens when the nest is degraded? You have a species atypical developmental system or nest. You're going to have a species atypical outcome, a species atypical creature. So instead of that nice companionship culture, we have a cycle of competitive detachment. You have undercare in early life. You have poor development then of the neurobiology, psyche. Everything about that child is poorly developed. The adults then turn out to have ill-being, and they're not very moral. They're very self-oriented. Of course, it's not a surprise. And then you have a degraded culture. The adults are overwhelmed, distracted, over-controlling, or even under-controlling. The helicopter and intrusive parenting, and then the detached kind of back and forth. So there's just a kind of a mess of a culture. So we have pictures of what happens to the brain. So this is a child who's neglected. So this is severe neglect, 3-year-old. On the left, a normal-sized brain. On the right, a neglected 3-year-old's brain. The size differences. You can see physiological effects of these things. Recent studies showed that gene synapses from major depression disorder. I like the picture here. So on the left is a normal brain. On the right, you can see those melted synapses. That's what happens with distress. Depression is a sign of a sickness. It's a general kind of sickness of the body. And that's what's going to, it will look like. So what happens then, instead of having this nice pattern of acting, instead you have toxic stress in early life is going to emphasize survival systems. I call it self-protection. You're going to have a disposition towards self-protection, and your stress reactivity is going to overwhelm your capacities for self-control. That's what happens. When the stress response kicks in, it shifts your blood flow, and it mobilizes you for action. And so it's action, physical, action or withdrawal, fight, flight, and if those don't work, freeze or faint, right? When you leave a baby to cry, at first they're going to get really mad, cry, 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 right? They're fighting. But after a while, if the parents don't come, their body says, oh, we're going to die if we keep doing this. Shut down. So they shut down, they stop growing. DNA synthesis slows down. Growth hormone slows down. And so that's why you have that brain size differences. The child's body has stopped growing. So when you have toxic stress, you've got the stress reactivity that gets upgraded. It floods the system. These things never got grown properly, and so they can't control back the toxic stress reactivity. And these things never got grown well either, the sociality. And even if they had, they do have capacities, the stress reactivity is going to wash those away. So when you're in a stress mode, let me just say too, if you are highly stress reactive, you're going to see threat everywhere, because that's the system that's enhanced. So when someone is frowning at you, you're going to take it personally. Or if someone accidentally bumps you, like aggressive kids, they say, oh, they did it on purpose, right? So you're always like this. You're always bracing against the world. And when you're in that mode, you're not going to be open-minded, and you're not going to be open-hearted. Those are the things that worry me. So instead, you're reactive. You keep shifting based on the situation. You're reacting instead, and so you're conditioned by your past. You're conditioned by your past. You have no free will in the moment then. So one of the key things, why are indigenous worldviews so different? Why do small band hunter-gatherers, why are they aware of the communications of animals, of plants, rivers, mountains? Why are they really in tune with all of life? Part of it is this: the right hemisphere grows rapidly right after birth, the first 3 years of life. This is what's developing. And if you're getting distressed instead, it doesn't develop properly. And so we have all these adults coming into therapy at age 50 after the kids are gone, and they can't cope. And it's partly because the right hemisphere isn't working properly. The right hemisphere is about here and now. It's about regulating who you are right now with others. You enjoy being with others. You have intersubjectivity. You're able to be attuned and flexible. You have emotional intelligence. You can read the faces of others. You can understand what they're communicating by the lift of the eyebrow in the moment. You have empathy. You're present emotionally. You can also self-transcend, and you have a sense of higher consciousness, this connection to the whole. So I think so I'm trying to link all this stuff together. What we're missing then, why are the typical Western person, dominant culture person, so clueless, right? It's partially this. And luckily, though, the right hemisphere can grow throughout life, but you have to be calm to grow it. So when you play tag and wrestle with kids, you're growing your right hemisphere because you have to be responsive in the moment, and it just throws you off. All that calculation, bracing can't be in place when you're playing. I really love this book, The Continuum Concept. My students and I read it all the time. Here's a good quote: feeling appropriate to an infant in arms. So when kids are carried day and night all the time, they can fall asleep and they feel safe, is his feeling of rightness or essential goodness, the premise that he is right, good, and welcome. Without that conviction, a human being of any age is crippled by a lack of confidence, a full sense of self, of spontaneity, and of grace. So again, that's going back to the touch, responsiveness, the caring for that baby in a way that allows them to be who they are meant to be, right? To let their spirit grow as it was designed. And the Dalai Lama, when he came to the United States the first time, said, wow, can't believe how many people feel so unconfident and down on themselves. It's just so commonplace. We think it's normal now. So added to this, what happens when the baby's psychological needs are ignored or minimized, they're going to develop distrust of others. So that leads to anxiety and cynicism later. Distrust of their own body, of their own cues. I'm feeling this need. Nobody's listening. Okay, well, let's shut it down, right? It's not worth it. Let's shut all that down. Go to your head. Alienation to living with others. They don't know how to do it, right? You don't get the back and forth, flexible, agile way of, you don't learn it because you're not in it. And so you develop, things, nerdiness, Asperger's-like things, where autism means socially awkward. So you develop social awkwardness. You're socially disagreeable because you don't trust anybody. And so you oppose or withdraw, you aggress or withdraw, and you have this impaired sense of self because nobody grew the self that was there. They kind of shut it down. So you have an empty self. So there's all sorts of psychological implications here. So you're going to have insecure attachment, blah, blah, blah. Already said that. You're going to probably be more oriented to materialism, which is what we see, because you don't know what else to latch onto, right? They give you a teddy bear instead of letting you sleep with them, the parents, right? Or, just hug your teddy bear and cry. That's fine.
Nothing in the crib.
Now they don't even do that, right? Nothing in the crib now. Oh, so you got to hang on to something, and so you start hanging on to your little iPhone, right? Or iPad, whatever it is. You need something. You're a relational being. You got to relate to something. So you're going to pick whatever you can. And so we have all sorts of adult stress reactivity governing our country. Now, I didn't say anything about psychopathology, but you can see that in extreme cases that a child is just going to shut it all down. No empathy. Just go for your own interests. And that's where we are. So what's happening then is I talk about multiple inheritances. And I'm not going to talk about them now, but if you don't get your needs met, every time is a risk factor. Don't breastfeed. Don't hold the child. Don't let them play freely. Those are all risk factors for falling off our normal course of development. And you're going to end up with a more self-focused personality. Whereas if you follow our designed original instructions, you're going to find that another inclusive personality. That's just the way it is. That's how we're intended to be, cooperative, not selfish and aggressive. So we study these things in my lab. And for example, on time. So on the left side, you can see some of the studies. This is just one of our sets of papers. Breastfeeding, whether they tried it or not, initiation, C-section or not, above that. Breastfeeding length, how much positive touch, responsiveness, play, and multiple caregivers. And then you see across the top, this is 3 to 5-year-olds. Empathy, conscious self-regulation, cooperation, IQ, depression, aggression. And everything colored means that we found it to be significant. The gray things were not tested, and the white ones were not significant. So this is all using statistical methods, hypothesis testing. Responsiveness, we usually control for that because it's related to everything. So how responsive you are. This is mother's reports, some of them, and some of it's mother observation, mother-child observation. So I relate all this to ethics and morality. So you can, any one of us can shift in how we approach every moment. We can be protectionistic. If this person reminds me of my abusive father, for example, or mother, uncle, or whatever, I'll go into protectionist mode. I will want to be one up or one down. Usually I withdraw, right? But aggression, if that works, I'll do that. But the ability to be in the moment, in the interpersonal dance, egalitarian dance, is this engagement ethic. It's face-to-face compassion. The imagination ethic builds on either one. There's different types. And so if it builds on engagement, it's communal. If it builds on protectionism, it's going to be vicious imagination, detached imagination, which is what we encourage in schools, what professors are good at, the kind of thing that West appreciates most, detached imagination. Very destructive, though, because it's cut off of relationships. So I guess that's more than, I'll keep going here. So when you don't have the early nest, you're going to have all sorts of issues. Inflated egos, distorted thinking and feeling and perception. You're governed by your past. You're going to be self-centered. You're going to have a one-person psychology, not knowing how to get along with others. So you're kind of oriented to self, narcissism. And here's one of our studies with adults. We asked them about their childhood, the nest. And we found that the more of that nest they had, the greater their secure attachment. That means that their habitual ways of relating to the social world were trusting. Mental health, less depression, less anxiety, more perspective-taking abilities, and we could do this pattern of relationships, and then more of that engagement ethic, the relational attunement. And then there was two negative pathways through here. Less of the nest, less secure attachment, worse mental health, personal distress in social situations, and self-protection of either the withdrawing or oppositional type. And we also have a bunch of studies with kids. This one is just asking, in the past week, these 6 questions. Did they have, how much affection did the child have? How much did the child get spanked? How much did they play freely outside? How much did they play freely inside? How much family togetherness at home and outside the home? Just these 6 questions we find are related to all these things. Well-being, happiness, and negatively to anxiety and depression. Negatively to social withdrawal, but positively to attunement, social enjoyment, social consideration. More capacities for self-control and empathy and conscience. So I always like to end with a little bit of advice. So most of us did not get what we needed, myself included. So this has been a self-discovery kind of, what's wrong with me, right? So what you need to do then is you pay attention to those three pieces. You have to learn to self-calm. So you want to see if you start to feel superior or inferior in any given moment. Let's see if this is, oh, I don't have it. And you have to realize, oh, that's self-protection. Calm down, breathe deeply, be trusting, practice trusting, right? And then also that detached from relationship, that, avoidant attachment, we professors have a lot of that, where you just go in your head and don't worry about, feelings. So you have to learn to build connections, practice emotional presence, play, lots of play with kids, with each other. And then if your imagination also matters. So if you're thinking only of humans, or only of your in-group, you've got to learn respect for the autonomy of the other than humans, expand your imagination to the web of connections, etc. Make decisions that are broad for the whole. Because we are humans, are biosocial, as I said, we're embodied. Our biology influences our sociality. We're embedded. Our social environments influence our biology. And we're inactive. Our psychobiology influences all of our capacities. And in my book, the 2014 book, Neurobiology and the Development of Human Morality, I contrast what I call primal wisdom. So this is indigenous wisdom and traditional Western wisdom. You can see there's a lot of things that are the same. Wisdom exists beyond intellect, accesses other realms, humans have special responsibilities. Practice involves surrender to the energy realm, ego detachment. Wisdom is state dependent. It's about oneness in love. Fear must be overcome. And then there are differences, and some critical differences here I circled. One is that the primal wisdom is you need to be compassionate towards all of the natural world, all the relationships in your landscape, whereas the West, it's about people. And what's feared most in primal wisdom is alienation from animal nature, where that's really feared in the West. Animal nature is scary, right? And I think it's because we misraised babies for so long, they think that's it. That's animal nature, is the misraised baby. So to remember that we are part of the tree of life we share, now we have all this evidence to support the indigenous view, that we share DNA with all these creatures. Did you know 50% with bananas? Remember that next time.
But it's so hard to relate.
Are you sure?
I don't feel like I can, like I get this banana over here. And
ask permission. So I suggest then that we have to expand our circle of concern. I try to do this with my students. We sit outside. We try to, relate to the trees, to build our sense of the whole. And really primary, I think, is the third one. We have to foster an ecological attachment to the local landscape and learn it. And this is where we need the indigenous who have lived in that landscape for generations to help us. But that's, I think, we have to feel for our landscape. We have to care for the animals, the plants that are there. If we're going to save ourselves, right, it has to be local. And so we've been removing all the invasive species in our land and planting natives to feed the native wildlife. And it's quite an endeavor. But this is the final message from Aldo Leopold, which is, again, an indigenous perspective. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Books, lots of books. And lots of thanks, and thank you.